Some people vanish into the dark, others step into the light just to be seen. He did both and made the world watch. In the final days of the 1960s, California pulsed with freedom, music, and revolution. But beneath the glow of change, something else was moving. A mind that would twist curiosity into fear and turn headlines into weapons. He called himself the Zodiac, a name that became a riddle, a curse, and the reflection of our deepest fears. This is his story, the man who played God with fear. You're watching Shadow Chapters, where the darkest truths are revealed, one story at a time. Subscribe before the next cipher arrives. It began on a quiet Friday night, December 20th, 1968. A two-lane road stretched between the hills outside Vallejo, California. It was called Lake Herman Road, the kind of place teenagers went when they wanted the world to disappear. Inside a parked Rambler sat Betty Lou Jensen, 17, and David Faraday, 18. They had plans, college dreams, and a sense of invincibility that belonged to their age. But before midnight, another car pulled up behind them. No headlights, no warning, just silence. A man stepped out, walked toward them, and ordered them from the car. He raised a gun, calm, mechanical, and fired. David collapsed beside the door, a bullet through his skull. Betty Lou ran. She made it 20 feet before the shots caught her from behind. 5 bullets tore through the darkness, ending her life beneath the stars. When police arrived, there were no witnesses, no motive, no trace. Just the whisper of tires on cold asphalt and a mystery written in blood. The case was labeled a double homicide, a tragedy, but nothing more. Not yet. 6 months passed. Summer returned to Vallejo, bright, loud, alive. But the shadow that had visited Lake Herman Road was still there, waiting. July 4th, 1969. The night of fireworks, families on lawns, music in the air. And in the quiet back roads beyond the city, 19-year-old Darlene Ferrin parked her brown Corvair at Blue Rock Springs Park with her friend Michael Mago. It was just before midnight when another car pulled up behind them. Headlights flared, then died. A man stepped out, a heavy-set figure, short-haired, calm. He raised a flashlight and the beam cut across Darlene's face. Without a word, he fired 5 rounds through the glass. The noise shattered the stillness, echoing through the park. Michael screamed. Darlene slumped. Then, silence. The shooter walked away, then came back and fired 5 more shots into their bodies. Michael Mago survived. Barely. His description was chilling in its normality. A white male, mid-30s, stocky, average height, a man who could have been anyone. At the hospital, bleeding and shaking, he told detectives, he didn't look like he was in a hurry. He looked like he was having fun. 40 minutes later, the phone rang inside the Vallejo Police Department. The operator answered. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite. I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye. The line went dead. Officers traced the call to a payphone near a gas station, barely a mile from the station itself. The receiver was still hanging loose, swaying slightly. No fingerprints, no witnesses. The same voice that confessed would soon speak again, to an entire city. Within weeks, 3 letters arrived at 3 different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope bore a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and each letter began the same way. Dear editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas, and the girl on the 4th of July. The writer described the murders in detail no one else could have known. He demanded the letters be printed on the front page, or more people would die. Attached was a puzzle, a cipher made of 408 symbols that he claimed would reveal his identity. He ended each note with that same mark, the circle and the cross. The Zodiac was born. The newspapers printed the letters, and the entire Bay Area erupted in fear. For the first time, the killer had a name, one he gave himself, and a voice that reached every home. Children were kept indoors. Police cars prowled empty streets. Reporters turned every clue into breaking news. And somewhere the Zodiac watched, smiling. He had learned that terror was louder when written in ink. When the cipher was solved a week later by schoolteacher Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, the message inside was worse than anyone imagined.
I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl.
2 weeks later, he struck again, this time in the middle of San Francisco. October 11, 1969, a clear night in Presidio Heights, a quiet, wealthy neighborhood near the northern tip of the city. At 9:55 p.m., a taxi driver named Paul Stein picked up a fare at the corner of Mason and Geary Streets. The passenger was white, male, mid-30s to early 40s, wearing glasses. He asked to be taken to Washington and Maple Streets. The ride took less than 10 minutes. At 9:58 p.m., the cab stopped, not at Maple, but 1 block east, at Washington and Cherry. Witnesses heard a single gunshot. A boy looking out his window saw the driver slumped forward and a man wiping down the car's interior. He tore a piece of the driver's shirt and calmly walked away, disappearing into the foggy streets. 3 teenagers called the police. Officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms, patrolling nearby, received the call and saw a white man walking east on Jackson Street. He looked ordinary, clean-cut, short hair, glasses. They let him pass. Minutes later, they reached the cab and found Paul Stein dead, shot once in the head. And when the Zodiac's letter arrived 3 days later, it confirmed their worst mistake. This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Street and Maple Street last night. To prove this, here is a piece of the shirt taken from the victim. Enclosed was a blood-stained square of fabric. He mocked the police for letting him walk away. Then he wrote something that changed everything. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The city went silent. Parents refused to send their children to school. Police cars escorted every yellow bus through the streets. Teachers checked every face at every stop. The Zodiac had turned an entire metropolis into his hostage. He had found a way to kill without pulling the trigger, through fear alone. Radio stations replayed the threat every hour. Talk shows debated his motives. Reporters hounded the police for answers that didn't exist. Every man with a pair of glasses and a calm voice became a suspect. Every anonymous letter was opened with dread. The Zodiac watched it all unfold from somewhere in that same city, smiling at how easily people danced to his tune. He wasn't just a murderer, he was an orchestrator. He played the media, the police, and the public like instruments. Each letter a new note in his symphony of chaos. His handwriting was precise, almost elegant. His phrasing was theatrical, arrogant, playful. He signed every message with the same mark, the circle and the cross, as though sealing a covenant. And every time a newspaper printed his words, he won. The police now realized they weren't dealing with a man who killed for impulse. They were dealing with someone who planned each act like an engineer of chaos, a performer who wanted an audience. Every time he wrote, his language shifted slightly, sometimes mocking, sometimes almost polite. It was as if he were changing masks with every letter, testing how far he could push the world before it broke. Officers across the Bay Area began to live in the rhythm of his threats. Each morning they asked the same question: would there be another letter? And if there was, who had died now? But the Zodiac didn't strike again right away. He had already created something even he couldn't kill: panic. Investigators started connecting him to earlier, unsolved cases. The Lake Herman Road murders, the Blue Rock Springs attack, and now, Presidio Heights. They built a psychological profile: male, intelligent, methodical, emotionally detached, possibly military trained. Someone obsessed with dominance, attention, and immortality. He didn't just want to escape the police. He wanted to humiliate them, to show that law and order meant nothing when fear ruled the streets. And he succeeded. By the end of 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner had devoted entire sections of print to his letters. Talk shows analyzed his handwriting. Theories filled coffee shops. Then came the 340-character cipher, mailed to the Chronicle in November 1969. The code was dense, intricate, impossible, a wall of symbols and letters unlike anything before it. He claimed it contained his identity, but even the military's best cryptanalysts couldn't solve it. The message stood as an open wound, a challenge to every mind that dared to try. It would remain unsolved for more than 50 years, schools and dinner tables. He had turned the world into his echo chamber. While the code sat unread, the killings, at least the confirmed ones, stopped. But the letters did not. He began sending notes about other crimes, other names, and potential victims. He teased the police with diagrams of bombs he claimed to have built, buried somewhere near Mount Diablo, timed to detonate when sunlight reached a specific angle. The instructions were detailed, too detailed to ignore. Teams of officers and volunteers combed the hills for any sign of explosives. They found nothing. The threat itself had done the job. The Zodiac had learned that fear was most powerful when unseen. In early 1970, another letter arrived. This one was stranger. It was addressed to the Chronicle and came with a card showing a dripping pen. Beneath it, the words, "My name is," followed by a new cipher, shorter, sharper, unsolved. He ended with, "By the way, have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is..." Again, he signed it with the circle and cross, adding the number 10. A scorecard. 10 lives claimed, perhaps, or 10 victories in his war against the system. But police could only confirm 5. Was he exaggerating? Or were there others the world would never find? As months passed, his letters grew more theatrical. He sent greeting cards with disturbing messages, a Halloween card to reporter Paul Avery, one of the journalists who covered him most. It featured a skeleton peering through a forest and the words, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." Inside, another threat, and yet again, that same haunting signature. For Avery and the newsroom at the Chronicle, it was no longer just a story. It was personal. The reporter began receiving anonymous tips linking the Zodiac to earlier murders, including one in Riverside in 1966, a young woman named Sherry Jo Bates. She had been stabbed to death near a library, and afterward, police received typed letters eerily similar in tone and structure to the Zodiac's. The handwriting matched. The phrases matched. The arrogance matched. If true, it meant the Zodiac had been killing long before anyone knew his name, but in truth, no one could tell where the myth ended and the man began. Some investigators believed there might be 2 Zodiacs, or that others were copying his letters to keep the terror alive. It was impossible to know. Every day, the line between fact and fiction blurred a little more. By the start of the new decade, the world had changed. America had moved into the 1970s, a decade that would see the rise of serial killers across the nation. Manson, Bundy, Gacy. But the Zodiac was different. He was never caught, never named, never even seen clearly. He became a symbol of what was possible when intelligence turned to evil and anonymity became power. In the final months of 1970, his tone began to fracture. His letters came less frequently. They were shorter, stranger, more erratic. He referenced the Mikado, a Victorian operetta about crime and punishment, quoting lines about death and vengeance as if reading from a personal scripture. Then early in 1971, he vanished. No murders, no letters, no calls. Just silence. It was almost as if he had grown bored. But silence was part of his design. It kept the world wondering when he'd speak again. And when he finally did, 3 years later, the message was brief and terrifying in its simplicity. January 29th, 1974. A letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, typed this time, not handwritten. It read, "I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen." Then, in a scrawl beneath it, "I am still out here. I am now having a ball." It was signed, once again, with that symbol. Then, he disappeared into history. By the time the typewriter ink dried, California had already begun to mythologize him. Police departments still held files inches thick with notes and dead ends. The FBI had spent years chasing patterns and symbols that led nowhere, but the Zodiac had already achieved what he wanted. He was no longer a suspect to be caught. He was an idea that couldn't die. And in that sense, he had won. By 1970, the Zodiac had become more than a man. He was a ritual, an ongoing conversation between violence and vanity, written in ink and blood. Every letter was an event, every symbol, a code, every word, a reminder that he was still in control. He didn't just kill, he spoke about killing, and in doing so, he made the world listen. The first cipher, the 408, had already been solved by the Hardin family months earlier. But in law enforcement offices, copies of the next one, the 340-character code, sat pinned to bulletin boards like a curse no one could lift. Agents, professors, and hobbyists stared at its grid of shapes for months. They tried mathematical patterns, linguistic models, mirrored alphabets. Nothing worked. The cipher refused to yield. It was like staring into the killer's mind and seeing only fog. Even the experts in military cryptography at the Pentagon took a look. They couldn't solve it either. The Zodiac had beaten them, and he knew it. His later letters dripped with mockery. The police shall never catch me because I have been too clever for them. To him, every failed attempt to decode his message was proof of superiority. He wasn't just taunting police, he was teaching them how small they were. Psychologists studying the case began to map out his personality through his words. He wrote like a narcissist, but thought like an engineer. Every sentence combined arrogance with order, chaos wrapped in logic. They noted his fixation on power, how he used phrases like "I shall" and "I will" rather than "I might." There was no hesitation in his language, only command. He was addicted to control, not only of victims, but of perception. He decided what people would fear when they would read his words, how they would react. And the public played along, every headline feeding his appetite. Across San Francisco, radio hosts read the Zodiac's letters aloud on air, their voices trembling even as they tried to sound composed. Listeners phoned in with theories, seeing his symbol in graffiti, in license plates, in dreams. The killer had turned a city into a living puzzle. He knew that the only thing stronger than terror was curiosity. That was his genius. He didn't need to kill every week to stay alive in people's minds. He just needed to make them wonder what he'd do next. By early 1970, investigators were overwhelmed. Every lead branched into another, every clue became noise. There were dozens of suspects, all of them plausible, none of them provable. But among them, one name stood out: Arthur Lee Allen. He was a former school teacher, intelligent, quiet, and unpredictable. He had once told a friend he liked the idea of hunting people for sport. He lived near the sites of the first murders. He even owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch engraved with the same symbol the killer used. Police found that detail almost too perfect, like fate or mockery. They searched his home and discovered weapons, strange drawings, and stories of cruelty. Yet, nothing definitive. His fingerprints didn't match those on the cab. His handwriting didn't match the letters. His DNA, when later tested, failed to connect him. He remained the perfect suspect and the perfect mystery. Meanwhile, new letters kept arriving. They came in uneven intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months, each one reigniting the panic that had barely begun to fade. One read, "I have grown rather angry with the police for their telling lies about me, so I shall change the way the collecting of slaves is done." Another declared, "I am not sick, I am insane." He seemed to relish confusing people, contradicting himself, mixing fact with fantasy. The language was part of the manipulation. To him, truth didn't matter. Only attention did. In April 1970, he mailed a new puzzle, the 13-symbol cipher, alongside a note beginning with his trademark phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking. By the way, have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is..." Then the cryptic code. It remains unsolved to this day. Some believe it hides a name, others a taunt, a message saying there never was one. Either way, the Zodiac had discovered his masterpiece, a crime that could live forever simply by refusing to end. Even without killings, his mythology deepened. Children drew his symbol in notebooks. Bars sold cocktails named after him. Tourists visited the murder sites. The Zodiac had become what he always wanted to be, famous. And in America, fame is a kind of immortality. When detectives met to compare notes, a pattern emerged. The Zodiac's handwriting changed slightly over time, his spelling too. Some letters were written in neat, deliberate lines. Others looked rushed, angry, unstable. It raised the question, was there more than one Zodiac? Or was the killer simply evolving, playing with expectation, rewriting his identity as he went? No one could agree, but one truth was clear. Every time people thought they understood him, he changed the rules. He controlled not just lives, but the narrative of his own legend. In the years that followed, the trail would twist through new suspects and false confessions. Each promised closure, each ended in disappointment. But before the 1970s were over, the Zodiac would make one final move, a quiet exit that left the world wondering whether they'd been chasing a man at all, or a myth too large to die. By 1971, the Zodiac had done what no killer before him had achieved. He had transformed crime into conversation. His words were printed beside politicians' speeches and war headlines. His symbol had become a warning label for an entire generation. But the letters had slowed, and with them, the killings, at least the ones police could prove. Silence replaced certainty, and in that silence, every shadow looked like him. Detectives from Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco gathered in late-night meetings, surrounded by stacks of reports and photographs. They were exhausted. For 2 years, they had been chasing smoke, a killer who knew the rules of the hunt better than the hunters. There were thousands of pages of notes, interviews, suspects, dead ends. And still, the same unanswered question. Who was the Zodiac? The investigation became a labyrinth. Every suspect opened a new door. Every clue branched into another maze. Police received thousands of tips, each one promising revelation, each one collapsing under scrutiny. Some came from people who claimed to have worked with the Zodiac. Others from neighbors, family members, ex-wives, or strangers, convinced the man next door was the killer. In time, paranoia itself became part of the case. The FBI officially joined the investigation, coordinating between city police departments that had begun to lose communication with one another. The Bureau's files grew thicker each month, filled with theories, suspect lists, and letters from self-declared codebreakers offering to solve the unsolvable. The Zodiac, it seemed, had created not one crime, but an entire ecosystem, a self-sustaining chaos that fed on curiosity. The leading suspect was still Arthur Lee Allen. Everything about him matched too neatly to ignore. He lived in Vallejo near the site of the early murders. He was intelligent, mechanically minded, and fascinated by ciphers. He had been dismissed from teaching after inappropriate behavior with children. He owned a wristwatch, brand name Zodiac, with the same circle and cross logo. Investigators found that coincidence too strange to be mere chance. When detectives first questioned him in 1971, Allen was calm, polite, and even helpful. He denied everything, offered alibis, and laughed at their suspicions. But there was something off about him. Something in the way he seemed to enjoy being accused. He told them he liked the idea of hunting people, quoting the same phrase found in the Zodiac's first cipher. He mentioned using a flashlight taped to a gun, the same method the killer had used at Blue Rock Springs. When police searched his trailer, they found knives, guns, and disturbing sexual materials. But not enough. His fingerprints didn't match those taken from the cab. His handwriting differed. And years later, when DNA testing became possible, the samples taken from the Zodiac's letters failed to link him. Allen remained the perfect suspect who could never be proven guilty. For the public, Allen became the face of the mystery. When Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle, began investigating the case privately, Allen's name appeared again and again in his research. Graysmith would later publish 2 books, and decades afterward, his obsession inspired David Fincher's 2007 film, Zodiac. But even with all that attention, the evidence never hardened. Allen died in 1992 of a heart attack, still under suspicion, still officially uncharged. The man who might have been the Zodiac was gone, and yet the legend remained alive. Other suspects surfaced through the years. Richard Gaikowski, a journalist known for his intellect and erratic behavior. Lawrence Kane, a Navy veteran with brain trauma who lived near the murder sites. Ross Sullivan, a library worker fascinated by cryptography, and known for wearing clothing similar to that described at Lake Berryessa. Each man fit pieces of the puzzle, but none completed it. There was always one missing link, one test result, one witness description that refused to align. The Zodiac had become a riddle so complex that even reality seemed to bend around it. And as investigators chased one phantom after another, the killer's legend only grew. Books appeared. Talk shows debated his identity. Amateur sleuths created homemade maps, cipher grids, and suspect boards in their basements. The case had escaped the police and entered the bloodstream of popular culture. To some, it was a story of evil genius. To others, a cautionary tale about the media's power to create immortality. But to the detectives who had lived it, it was a wound that refused to close. They had dedicated years to chasing a man who might have been an illusion, a ghost born of words and fear. And yet every time they looked at those letters, they could feel him, the voice that signed, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The trail of letters continued into the early 1970s. Some were authentic, others were almost certainly hoaxes, and yet each was treated with the same urgency. Police could never afford to assume the next one wasn't real. Then, in 1974, one final confirmed letter arrived, short, strange, typed instead of handwritten. It read, "I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. And beneath it, in handwriting again, I am still out here. I am now having a ball." It was signed with the circle and cross. Then, nothing. That was the last letter that could be definitively proven to be his. The Zodiac had left the stage, but the echo of his presence filled the empty space he left behind. After the Exorcist letter, the silence was heavy, but no one believed it meant the end. The police waited. Reporters waited. And in that waiting, the Zodiac's myth began to grow stronger than any new crime could have made it. He had turned absence into presence, silence into fear. The task forces that had been built to find him slowly dissolved, replaced by new priorities, new killers, new crises. But a handful of detectives refused to let go. They carried the files with them through transfers, promotions, and retirement. Some of them would die with the case still open on their desks. They would describe the Zodiac investigation as a maze with no center, a puzzle built to trap the people trying to solve it. The case inspired a new kind of police work. The idea of criminal profiling, the study of a killer's psychology, was still young, but the Zodiac became one of its earliest and most haunting examples. Agents at Quantico analyzed his letters and behavior, describing a man who was male, white, above average intelligence, emotionally detached, socially alienated, and utterly addicted to the feeling of control. They said he probably followed news coverage of himself obsessively, cutting out articles, reliving his own fame. He was the kind of man who couldn't stand to be ignored. The letters were his way of staying alive. It made perfect sense. He didn't need to keep killing to feel powerful. He just needed to keep talking. Yet for all the psychological insight, the investigation kept hitting the same wall. No fingerprints matched, no handwriting sample was a perfect fit. Every suspect had an alibi or a test result that ruled him out. Each time detectives thought they had him cornered, the evidence slipped through their fingers like smoke. And still, the fear never truly went away. In coffee shops, on buses, in late-night bars, people whispered that he might be the man sitting next to them. Ordinary, polite, invisible. The true terror of the Zodiac was that he looked like everyone else. The story might have ended there, sealed inside yellowed folders and fading memories. But the Zodiac symbol, the circle and cross, refused to fade. It appeared on t-shirts, tattoos, even graffiti. It became shorthand for unsolved evil, a reminder that not every story ends in justice. In the decades that followed, new waves of investigators and journalists tried to reopen the case. Each generation brought new tools: forensic linguistics, handwriting databases, DNA analysis. Each promised the final answer. And each time, the Zodiac slipped back into the fog. He seemed to exist outside time itself. Every new technology only made the mystery deeper, as if he had designed it to survive forever. Meanwhile, his influence spread. Other killers began to mimic him, writing letters to newspapers, choosing symbols, playing games with the police. What the Zodiac had invented was a template for the modern serial killer, a persona that lived as much in the public's imagination as in reality. He had discovered that fear could be manufactured like a product, and America, in its hunger for sensational headlines, became his perfect marketplace. Even as the years passed, the mystery still called to people. Some became lifelong investigators, devoting decades to decoding his ciphers. Others lost their families, their sanity, even their health in pursuit of the truth. The Zodiac became a mirror for obsession itself. The closer people got to solving him, the more they began to resemble him. Isolated, secretive, obsessed with patterns no one else could see. It was as if his final victim had been reason itself. Half a century after his first crime, the man who had written himself into history remained untouchable. He had outlived nearly every detective who hunted him, every witness who saw him, and every journalist who wrote his name. What remained was a set of letters, a handful of symbols, and a legend that refused to die, because perhaps that was the real goal all along. Maybe the Zodiac never intended to be caught. Maybe his true crime was building a story that could never end, a story powerful enough to keep people searching long after he was gone. Investigators still revisit the evidence every few years. The envelopes, the bullets, the fragments of Paul Stein's torn shirt are preserved in temperature-controlled vaults. Some of the letters are handled with gloves, scanned again and again, as if technology might one day reveal what human eyes could not. And maybe it will. Because the Zodiac case is more than history, it's a living experiment in obsession. Every new tool, artificial intelligence, genetic genealogy, linguistic analysis, is another mirror turned toward the same question. Who was he? Each generation believes it will be the one to break the code, and each generation discovers the same thing. The Zodiac's greatest weapon was not his gun or his knife. It was the idea of him. He proved that fear could live longer than flesh. When you read his words today, they no longer sound like confessions. They sound like instructions. How to manipulate the world with mystery. He understood the human mind better than most psychologists ever could. He knew that the absence of truth creates a vacuum people can't stop trying to fill. And in that vacuum, he would live forever. The circle and cross symbol became a portal into that emptiness. Every line of the cross pointed outward, to his victims, his hunters, his readers, and the circle drew them all back in. A perfect design. Endless. Over the years, filmmakers, novelists, and musicians borrowed his image. He appeared in Dirty Harry, The Exorcist, Mindhunter, Zodiac. Each retelling gave him a new face, a new voice, a new immortality. And with each version, the real man disappeared a little further, until all that was left was legend. For the families of his victims, that was the cruelest truth of all. They had lost children, lovers, brothers, and the killer had gained fame. Their grief had become a story the world couldn't stop telling. To them, the case was never about symbols or ciphers. It was about empty chairs at dinner tables, photographs that would never age, and questions that time refused to answer. For every decoded message, there was a mother who never saw justice. For every new suspect, a life that could never be restored. Today, in the San Francisco Police Department's cold case files, the Zodiac sits beside other unsolved names. But his folder is thicker than all the rest. Inside are photographs of the dead, faded fingerprints, and photocopies of the letters that once froze an entire state in fear. Detectives still open it sometimes, not because they expect to find something new, but because they can't stand to leave it closed. They read his handwriting again, trace the lines of the cross within the circle, and wonder if they're touching genius or madness, or both. No matter how far technology advances, one truth remains unchanged. The Zodiac is the reminder that some mysteries are built to last. He didn't just escape justice, he rewrote what justice means when the killer becomes a myth. So who was he? A teacher? A soldier? A man sitting quietly in a diner, reading about himself in the newspaper? Or was he, as some believe, more than a man? An archetype of evil born from a century that worshipped attention. Maybe the answer is hidden not in the codes, but in us. Because every time we open his letters, every time we watch another documentary, every time we whisper his name, we play his game again. He wanted to be remembered. And we remembered. There's a line he wrote that still feels like a prophecy. When they do finally crack me, they will have me in the paper for eternity. He was right. Half a century later, his story is still being told, in ink, in film, in fear. He built a legacy that no court could erase and no grave could silence. And in that sense, the Zodiac won. You've been watching Shadow Chapters, where history's darkest truths are spoken aloud and the echoes of the past still whisper through the present. Subscribe and step carefully into the next shadow.